2,000 years ago, there were 4 biographers of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's kind of interesting, in all of their biographies, they focus an inordinate amount of time on Jesus' last week. Now think about that. That's unprecedented. You're writing a biography of Abraham Lincoln or Benjamin Franklin. You may focus a little bit on the last week, but like most of your time on the last, or think about Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, the last week could tell you something, but I mean, he's such a good. There's so many good teachings there. You spend a lot of time about in the rest. I was like, if Jesus is just a good teacher, if he's just a good moral person, you would fully expect him to spend a balanced amount of time on most of his adult life. But no, they focus so much of their time on the last week. Why? There's an old saying: great doors swing on small hinges. The writers of the stories of Jesus, the biography of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, understood the door of history swings on the hinge of 3 days: the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That those 3 days answer our questions. All of those things coming at us, and we're wondering, how can we navigate our way through life? How can we find answers? They are all settled in those 3 days in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You say, Brett, what do you mean by that? I'm really glad you asked. Let me just talk about a few of them this morning. The first is the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus Christ is really alive, he answers our questions about God, our doubts about God. It is natural for people to have questions and doubts about God. I remember growing up as a kid thinking, man, how do I know I just got lucky and grew up in a family that believes the right things? I need to ask the questions. Who is God? What is he like? Is he personal or impersonal? Is he loving or is he angry? Is he close or is he distant? Is he like Mr. Rogers or is he like Mr. T or is he like Mrs. C's, giving candy all the time? Whatever. I mean, who is he really? Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Now that's either claptrap, it's either made up, or it's true. And the Bible said, the New Testament Christianity, historic Christianity has all said, whether we believe Jesus or not, have you seen me, you've seen the Father, whether you believe that or not, all rises and falls on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:14 says, if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation is in vain, and so is your faith. This is unique to world religions. Go to the grave of Buddha or Moses or Confucius or Muhammad and call out for them, and they are dead silent. Go to the graves of the great philosophers, and as much as they talked in life, they are now in the grave. But speak to Jesus, and he says, I am alive. The grave, the tomb is empty. I am here. And again, the reasonable question to ask is, can I be sure? How do I know? No, some people just assume it's not true because they have a naturalistic predisposition. They have this assumption about the world that the universe is closed, miracles aren't happening, the resurrection's a miracle, and therefore it didn't happen. And the reason those people in the New Testament times, those first century times, believed it to be true as well, they're not as sophisticated as we are. They believed in superstitious things. Well, that there's one thing that people of all times have been pretty clear on, and that is that dead things stay dead. They weren't non-compos mentis. They understood these things. Reminds me of the woman who looked out her window and saw that her German shepherd was kind of chewing the life out of the neighbor's rabbit. And she thought, oh my word, her relationship with the neighbor was already bad. If her dog kills the rabbit, it's going to be Vesuvius next door. It's going to be horrible. So she rushes outside, gets the dog to let go of the rabbit, but it's too late. The rabbit's already dead. She's not sure what to do. She panics. She picks up the rabbit, takes it upstairs, gives it a bath, shampoos its fluffy fur, blows the fur dry, makes it look as lifelike as possible, sneaks next door, puts the rabbit in its cage, sneaks out. About 2 hours later, she hears the neighbor lady screaming. "Ah, what's wrong? What's wrong?" She rushes out. "What's wrong?" "My rabbit," she says. "My rabbit. What's wrong with your rabbit? What's wrong with your rabbit?" She says, "My rabbit died 2 weeks ago. We buried, and it's back." See, there's one thing people have pretty much known since the beginning of time, is that dead buried things tend to stay dead and buried. You don't have to be a genius to know those things. Interesting, New Testament scholar N.T. Wright said there were many messianic movements in the first century. In every case, the would-be Messiah got crucified by Rome as Jesus did. In not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming their hero had been raised from the dead. They knew better. Read the New Testament accounts. The last thing that the followers of Jesus expected before the resurrection was a resurrection. Jesus gets arrested in the garden, they run. Jesus is on trial, they deny him. They're afraid for their life. They're not expecting, they're going to crucify him, but he's going to live again. No, they expected the dead to stay dead. You say, okay, so let's just say that I grant that there is supernatural, that there is a God who created the world, and if he did, then supernatural is natural for him. But how can I really know? How can I be confident that what the Bible says about Jesus' resurrection is true? One of the advantages of living in modern day is there are so many people who have done so much good work on this. One person recently who has done this work is a man by the name of J. Warner Wallace. I've been talking about him more recently. In 1996, he called himself a committed atheist and cold crime investigator. Still does work for NBC Dateline. He said he heard a preacher describe Jesus as, quote, the smartest man who ever lived. And he thought to himself, I am going to use my cold crime investigative techniques to discover whether that statement is true or not. He said the greatest cold crime in history is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a cold crime. People who saw it aren't still alive. You have to take those techniques. And so he did. He said there are 4 questions that he typically asks of any eyewitness criminal investigation. The questions are, were the authors really present to see what they said they saw? Was the reportage accurate? Could their claims be corroborated by external evidence? Were their claims consistent, or did the story about Jesus change over time? Were they motivated to lie? By the way, it seems like every Easter you find the articles, you find the television shows talking about how Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, and all this stuff was constructed later on. Those people are either ignorant, and I don't think they're ignorant. I think they're just they could just be illogical. But I think they're just willfully deceptive. He said, for the next 6 to 8 months, I investigated the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ like many cold cases I've solved over the years. He says, I've never lost a cold case. I wish I had time to go into all of the details of what he found here. But basically, he said, he was overwhelmed by the evidence. By the way, I guess I'll deal with this. One of the things that you'll hear most often is, the stories about Jesus' resurrection didn't really develop until later on. There's like a 4th century thing that they can't, or just, like there's this really popular thing out there about how Jesus became the Christ. As though he didn't really teach these things, he didn't really believe these things, but later on they created them. He calls this the chain of custody issues. The claims that Jesus' resurrection passed down consistently or they changed over time. He said, the students of the Apostle John, for example, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp, reiterated John's claims without modification. Ignatius and Polycarp then repeated the gospel claims faithfully to their students, Irenaeus, and without altering them. If you want to hear about stuff like the Trinity, that doctrine was not created in the 4th century. You have people like Polycarp writing about them in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. As I examined the ancient letters of these church fathers, I discovered that the truth about Jesus could be reconstructed from their letters to one another, to their local congregations. The facts about Jesus were never altered along the way. So anytime you hear that stuff about how Jesus became the Christ, and this stuff was all fabricated later on, is just not historically accurate. Okay, bottom line, he says, the gospel authors passed the 4-part test I typically applied to eyewitnesses in my criminal cases. Their written accounts reliably and accurately describe the resurrection of Jesus without ulterior motive. They had no motive. The 3 motives to lie: sex, power, and money. And he said they didn't get any of those 3. When I realized this was the case, he says, everything changed for me. The resurrection of Jesus Christ was true. He said the only thing that he had to overcome at that point was, will I believe in the supernatural? Or am I willing to give up my assumption that is not based on fact or evidence, that's just an assumption that the world is a closed universe and the supernatural is not possible? See, if the resurrection is true, then Jesus' claim is true. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And you can discover the answers to the great questions that you have of life. Who is God? Does he love me? Who is God? Is he close to me? Who is God? How can I find salvation? Who am I? Why am I here? What gives meaning to suffering? What gives hope for the future? All those answers are in Christ. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident, said, the simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. One word of truth outweighs the world's. Friends, there's one word of truth that outweighs the whole world, and that one word of truth is resurrection. Jesus is alive. The tomb is empty, so we can know who God is. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. He answers your questions.